Hello everyone, my name is Shaun Mooney and welcome to my Imagine 2020 talk. I'm a concept artist and game designer working in the UK games industry. So before I start the talk, here's a little bit of info about myself. I'm currently employed at TT Games, but I can't talk about anything I'm working on there, that's all top secret. But I can tell you that I was the lead concept artist for TT for a number of years. Before that I was the creative lead artist at Clever Beans. I also worked at Playdemic as an illustrator, animator, concept artist. I was also a concept artist at Atom Hawk Studios, and I got my start in the industry working at Embryonic Studios as a 3D artist and junior game designer. So what am I going to be talking about today? Well, I want to talk about a particular skill that I think is really important to develop if you're working as an artist, and especially if you're working as a concept artist, and that is developing artistic range. So what do I mean by artistic range? In the simplest terms, I mean it's really good to be able to draw lots of things in a multitude of styles. And the reason that I think this is a really good skill to have, especially as a concept artist, is that every single game and product that you work on all has its own unique art style. So what is art style? Well, art style is basically a visual language that communicates things to the player. So let's look at a few examples of some games that I think have really distinct and very cool art styles. So this is from Software's Bloodborne. And when you look at these screenshots, you can see this game has a very strong mood, look, and atmosphere. And it's all conveyed to the player through its art style. It has something that I call like fantastical realism. It's not exactly photorealistic, but it is in no way toon either. The starting location of the game, the city of Yharnam, takes its inspiration from neo-Gothic architecture. What it does is it takes that and then it just ramps it up a few notches to create this really cool, unique, fantastical looking environment. The shape language, the character designs, the colours, the lighting, the atmosphere, these are all telling the player something about this game before you even play it. So it's like the perfect art style and setting for an action horror game. So now let's take a look at another game which has its own art style, which is completely on the opposite end of the spectrum when compared to Bloodborne, and that is Rayman Legends. So this game still has a very strong, unique look all of its own, but the mood, tone, and atmosphere are completely different. It completely embraces a toony, stylized art direction. Its art style is almost like it's trying to mimic traditional cell animation with its hand-painted backdrops and exaggerated character designs. The shape language, colours, lighting, all the stuff in this example comes across as playful, light-hearted and funny, which is all perfect for an arcade platformer. Then when you compare the two art styles next to each other, you can see just how different they are. Each one is unique to the product that it's designed for, and each of these tell you something about those games without you even having to play it. So how do games get their own art style? The art styles are usually developed by someone at the studio who's called the art director. They're the ones who are responsible for working with the concept artist to help generate designs and ideas about how games can look. Underneath the art director, you'll normally have a lead concept artist, and then underneath that lead concept artist will be a team of concept artists. They all work together and try and come up with designs, and it goes through this process of iteration, eliminating stuff that doesn't work until you get down to the nub of what you think your game should look like. And at that point, you should have a series of designs, which can then be put into an art bible, which is something that the team will then use as a guide and a set of rules when making the artwork for the game you're working on. So at the start of my talk, I mentioned that concept artists need to be able to draw a multitude of things. So what type of things do we draw? Let's look through a few examples. So some of these are products that I've worked on that already had an established art style, and in some examples I was the one creating the art style as I was working as art director on them projects. So character designs, this is obviously a big one in concept art. You find yourself designing a lot of characters for games. Here you can see me experimenting with a range of ideas for an explorer character. Started off with this sheet and we ended up refining it down to these Russian cosmonaut designs. Sometimes you're not drawing humans, sometimes you're drawing things like this, which is robots. Same thing as the last sheets you saw, it's just me experimenting with shapes, ideas, getting them all down so as the team can sit down, look and discuss which ideas we think are best before we move forward. Here's something very different from the last two sheets. It's neither humanoid or a robot, it's more of a monstrous design, but this game had a lot of humour and comedy in it, so it had to come across in the art style. It's not serious, it's not scary, as opposed to this design, which is personal work, where this was just me experimenting. Very different, it's humanoid, but very monstrous looking, and very, very different from the last image you just saw. So another thing concept artists have to draw a lot of is environments, and that can range from exterior, sunny, bright, playful, toony looking environments. And again, going very different from the last image, we now have some interiors from Arkham Asylum. Very dingy, rundown, moody, decrepit looking environment. Here's some work I did for Rhyme. So this is very different from the last two again. It's more natural landscapes, has a different palette, lighting setup, has a different tone and feel from the last images. And here's some stuff from Little Big Planet. So Little Big Planet, as you know, has a very distinct art style. I had to be able to jump on the project and make sure that I could get in tune with the way the game looks and produce some concept art that was fitting with the art style that was already established. So another thing that needs designing, which is related to the environments, are props. So there can be different types of props. The props are designed here for Ryan were very much linked to the gameplay, so they were very important. Whereas in some cases, they're just incidental background props and they're just there as part of the set dressing. Point being that you have to think about all the elements that sit in the environment, whether you interact with them or not, they all need designing. This also extends to other things in the games that the players interact with, so maybe it's pickups, items that you use, power-ups, things like that. The weapons that a player may use in a game. If you're designing an FPS, someone needs to think about and design out all the weapons and guns for the game. So another thing is vehicle design, very important. Lots of games feature different types of vehicles. Maybe in some games you need vehicles that you can race around the environment in. Maybe you're working on a combat game where you might need some aerial assault vehicles like this drone controlled bomber. Or something a bit more out there like this walking armoured tank idea. And lastly, here's two examples of a couple of things that concept artists aren't really known for doing, but it's still part of the job. And that is drawing things like particles and VFX concepts for the animation and VFX teams to then implement into the game. And lastly, here's some examples of concepts for branding. Again, like a lot of the other examples, the art style of this branding also needs to communicate something to the player. So when designing logos like this, the game identity needs to come across in the visuals. So for the next part of my talk, I figured what I would do would be a demonstration. I decided I would do a new personal project where I would design a vehicle in one art style and then do it again in a completely different art style. So what I'm going to do now is take you through my design process from sketches all the way through to final design. The goal here is to end up with two different illustrations that convey the art style of two different games. I'll also be using a wide range of techniques to help me get the best results for each art style. So here's what I did. I wrote myself a little brief for each one of the projects. So here is brief 1. Design a near future looking APC that would feature in a AAA next gen FPS game. So here are my art style and art direction goals for this brief. Stylized realism. So to me what this means is I want this thing to look real, like it could exist, but it's not about making something that is exactly photorealistic. It has to look like it could exist in a few years, so nothing too sci-fi looking, and it has to look believable to the player and be grounded and functional looking. The tone of the game is serious and gritty, and that needs to come across in the concept art. Must include a functional looking weapon system of some kind, and it has to have a good range of articulation and movement. So this is quite an important part of the brief. It says that it has to have a functional looking working part designed for the vehicle. I'm not an engineer, I can't really figure out how these things work, but I need to give the illusion that what I'm designing does. Must also include a working entrance exit for the troops to disembark from. So just like the last point, I need to figure out how this bit works, so I'm going to have to do a lot of research. And lastly, this thing has to look battle worn. I don't want this thing to look factory new, I want it to look like it's already seen a bit of action, so it needs some weathering, scrapes, dents, things like that. Stuff that I feel just adds quite a lot of character to the vehicle. So first things first, when I'm doing any design and stuff like this, you've got to have good ref and research. I get asked about this by students a lot. They for some reason think that using ref is cheating, and I'm not quite sure where that idea has come from. But trust me, like all concept artists that do any good work are all using ref. Reference is really, really important for guiding your design. It helps you get all the cool details and the right look you want, but it's also a really good starting point to give you ideas so you're not just staring at a blank canvas. Another good little tip here is that when you're doing this stuff, make sure to arrange your ref neat and tidy. This way that if anyone ever needs to tech your ref or take over the project, they've got a nice board there where you can see all the inspiration that you're already pulling from. So once I've got a good bit of ref together, I then start to think about the first stage of the design. Now, I always start with 3D, especially if I'm doing something like vehicle or hard surface design. Reason for this is that I like to think about the thing in a 360-degree way. So I'm thinking about the form, the depth, and the height here. And also, this is really going to help me speed up the sketching process later, because when you use 3D, you get all your perspective information already in the image, and I don't have to draw out grids in Photoshop. So it's just also a time-saving device. So now that I've made myself some very basic 3D looking meshes, I will screen grab them and then take them over into Photoshop and use them as a base to now produce some line work sketches. So this is kind of the thing that concept artists do the most, is produce loose ideas like this. I'm just looking at my ref and I'm looking for cool shapes and just panelization ideas that I can bring over into this design. I'm not thinking about details, so it's still very loose and it's very broad at this point. You won't see me go in and draw really, really fine details because that's just not important at this point in the design process. All that's important is creating a sheet of ideas that I can step back later, look at them all, and assess where the design is going. So this is very basic, very, very meat and potatoes concept artwork. Once I have a couple of ideas, I'll then reduce the opacity on the last sketch and then use that as a base to draw over a new sketch. So you can see that the 3D give me a really good starting point here. I don't have to draw out loads of perspective grids and things like that. I'm using the base shape that I created as that ruler, for want of a better word, to sort of guide where my lines go and make sure that the thing looks correct in perspective. So the brief called for a weapon design, which is what I'm doing here. Now, I'm not worried about the articulation so much here, just more the look and feel of the weapon and the overall shapes. I can fix the articulation part later once I get to that point in the design, but at this point, like I said, it's really early days. It's just about creating some loose sketches, something that I can just sit and think about. And yeah, we can fix problems like that later. So once the line work part's done, I'll start to add like a very simple grayscale wash. This is not complicated painting again, this is very quick, very rough, very scrappy. It's just something I do just to make the forms read and pop from a distance. Maybe I'll do things like make this look like a different material by putting a different tone on there. So I kept the body white and then I made the tyres these darker grey just so they stand out. Again, it just helps the different forms and shapes pop a bit more. I'm also now just doing a very, very basic wash, just adding a bit of that basic weathering just to give it a bit of life and make sure that it's got a little bit of that battle worn thing that was mentioned in the original brief. Here I'm just using Photoshop to do some very basic tricks like get some tread ideas on these tyres, but again, very scrappy, very loose, just about ideas at this point. So I'll just repeat that process a few times and then come up with a couple of ideas. Once I have all them ideas, I'll lay them out on a sheet and start to think about it. And there's usually a little bit of something on each one of these designs. So I just make little notes about that, color code them, thinking I'm going to take some of these elements through into the next part of my design. So I'll then go back into 3D. I've got my first sheet of sketches with my little notes. and I'll start to take all those shapes and elements that I liked in all the designs and make a very, very basic but new 3D mesh which will serve as the next base for the next round of sketches. So here's the next stage in the design. This is a slightly more detailed sketch than the previous ones because now I'm starting to get a feel for where this design is going. So I've added a lot more ideas that I have pulled from the ref, things like the armor plating, smoke launchers, things like that. Also started to design out the back of the APC. It's important that it has that door element from the brief, so using the 3D I can do a quick turnaround, take some screenshots and start to design out what this thing looks like from the rear also. So before I move on to the final stage of the design for this thing, I wanted to come back and look at the weapon and the door. Currently this one stylistically just did not look near future. It was too modern looking and didn't really convey the articulation that I felt it needed, so I had to go back to the ref and think about how I could redesign this to make it answer the brief. And here's what I came up with. So I went straight into 3D this time, looked at the ref and was able to come up with a new design where I could get it to look a bit more articulated and move, just in case an animator ever wanted to get hold of this and animate the components like the missile launcher and smoke launcher. And I think visually it just looks more near future. I also did the same with the rear of the APC as well. I had to add this split in the door so it could open in two stages like this to make sure that it had clearance when opening to allow troops to disembark from. So here is my finished design. Again, I'm using 3D here because I'm going to do a paint over of this. So I've added a lot more detail than there was in the last ones, but it's still a very simple and crude model by today's standards. But it's absolutely perfect for what I need to do the finished final concept. So what I did next was take my simple model and then stick it into Keyshot to do a high quality render to serve as the basis for the paint over. What I also did here was ask a friend and fellow concept artist, a chap called Mason Rosenquist, to help out with something. What he did for me was set up these materials here. So when I render these out, I can select these using the wand in Photoshop and they act as quick mask selects. So when I'm painting a very particular part of this APC, I can use those masks to quickly make selections and it saves me a hell of a lot of time down the line. So yeah, cheers Mason, nice one for that. You should all give Mason a follow, he's a really talented, great concept artist. So now we'll bring over the Keyshot renders and start to add the colour in Photoshop for the final concept. First thing I do is use the quick select masks that I got from Mason and then break up this huge big blue shape. All these components and different bits, I want them to look like they are made out of different things. And if they're all the same colour and material, it just doesn't really read as a believable, realistic looking design. So that's always the first thing I do when I'm doing these concepts is start to break up the shapes into smaller and bigger manageable pieces. So the next thing I start to do is think about exaggerating and punching up the lighting a little bit. Currently it's very flat looking and that's from the Keyshot render. The lighting setup in Keyshot was just to give me a basic idea about the light direction, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to stick with that and use that for the final concept. So by making a few selections of certain panels that are at certain angles, I can start to paint in and up the contrast of the lighting here. This just makes the forms pop and just makes the image look a little bit cooler and a little less flat looking. Once I've adjusted the lighting, I then start to think about the material. What is this thing made out of? It's supposed to be metal, so I need to get some texture in there. And the way I'm getting this in is I'm using a lot of custom brushes in Photoshop. This is where custom brushes are used really well. They are not a substitute for your art and design skills. That is all your fundamental skills. So having a cool set of brushes is not going to make you a better artist. But what it will do is allow you to achieve certain effects like this very quickly if you know how to control them. But don't make the mistake in thinking that custom brushes will make you a better designer, a better artist. It's just not true. So once I've added some surface detail and texture to this APC, the next thing I think about is breaking up the shapes in a different way from just adding material and colour differences. So when you look at something that's been manufactured, it is very rarely one just giant lump. It is made out of multiple little pieces that are all put together to make a bigger thing. So what these lines and panelization details do, which I'm adding here, is just make the APC look constructed. It just makes it look a bit cooler, and it makes it look a bit more believable. You know, the human eye is very good at detecting things that don't look right. So even things like this, I need to think about making sure that at a glance it looks right and believable, even though it's completely made up. And what's guiding my placement and use of all these things you see in here is the reference. I always have the reference to hand when I'm painting. It's just to the right of me. And I'm looking at that thinking, okay, add this detail, add that detail, like this thing here. I think to make components on these vehicles lighter, they mill out little cavities, which I saw in the reference. So I'm just adding that to my design too. So another really good technique concept artists use is something called photo bashing. What photo bashing does is allows you to get a realistic looking element to your painting without too much effort. If you think about you wanting to paint this element in by hand and get that level of finish and quality to it, it's quite time consuming. Whereas if you just take a photograph, cut it up, place it over your concept, use the warp tools and stuff like that to bed it right, you can get quite a cool little detail without too much effort. But what you need to do is bed it into your concept image, and you do that by painting back over it and adjusting the colors. If you just leave it as is, it just pops as it won't match. So you need to do a bit of work by hand just to get it to look right within the concept. So one part on the APC that needed a particular bit of work with photo bashing was the tires. So in the render, the color, the lighting and the material was kind of right, but they are very, very plastic looking. So to get around this, I got some photographs of tires and did a lot of photo bashing to add a lot of that texture and grime that I needed in there. So I went and found some good ref, cut them up, used the warp tools and placed them over the tires. Now again, this is a really good example of why you have to do a lot of bedding in with the image. When you just slap it on and then put a layer effect in there, it's very obvious what you're doing. So if you get the eraser and start to erase chunks out and paint stuff back in, this is what I mean by bedding it in. It's not 100% perfect, but it doesn't have to stand up to that scrutiny. It just needs to be just enough that when you look at it, you think that looks like a rubber tire that has seen a lot of action. It looks like it's been driving over all types of surfaces. It's got some grime, it's got dirt, little scratches, things like that. So this is where photo bashing is really, really helpful. Painting all that detail by hand would just be incredibly time consuming, whereas this helps sped up the process. Once I'd done the tyres, I felt I needed to go back and add some more surface detail to the main body of the APC. So what I'm doing here is using a different set of custom brushes. These are custom brushes which are specific for doing one thing. So I have some that do like scratches and wear and tear. So I'm just dotting these around the image and then erasing out where they wouldn't scratch, where the scratches don't continue across the surfaces. It's very similar to the photo bashing technique. A lot of these brushes were actually made from photos, but they're really, really handy and good for getting that wear and tear along edges, scrapes, scratches, things like that. And again, I'm just adding more character to this APC, making it look like it's seen more action. So one additional idea I had about the final presentation for this was to throw in some extra light sources which would just make the scene look a little bit more interesting, a little bit more cool. In the keyshot render, it's just a very flat top-down lighting thing, which is great. It still reads as a design, but what I felt it needed was just a little extra something to add a bit of excitement to the scene. So I had the idea of adding these flares that had been popped and thrown either side of the APC. Problem with that is I now have to paint in and work out how this light is affecting the APC. So when you add a new light into the scene, you have to then think, right, this light is now projecting up onto the APC. So certain faces and panels will now have to receive that light. As you can see here, it's quite a bright pinkish purple colour. So it'd be a very prominent colour that would then project up onto the cool blue sort of gunmetal grey of the APC. I did say that it's possible to add very bright colours even though it's supposed to be a very serious gritty looking game, but these pinks and purples are quite complementary to this blue APC, so I think it fits. Here I'm just drawing out some selections with the marquee tool and thinking about, right, all these surfaces are now going to be receiving this new light source. So this wasn't in the original concept, but it's cool. I can paint all that detail back in there, make sure that it matches. So one of the final touches I always add to my designs is adding accents, colour accents here and there, and also little decals. Things like little numbers, serial codes and things like that. They just make things look, again, a bit cooler, and it's something I've seen in the ref. So what I'm doing here is creating a bigger graphic design element that I want to stick on the side of the APC. To me, it's just not a sci-fi vehicle unless you have some kind of big chevron plastered in there. So I create this design, use the skew tool in Photoshop and start to place it around the vehicle where I find it needs a bit of extra detail. Now, all these panels that I'm placing it over are all at different angles, so you have to do a lot of thinking about how this shape will move and travel over these surfaces, making sure that the lines are all traveling in the right direction, and then also working out where this painted element isn't going, so I had to erase a bit there as it's going under those reactive armor panels. Also, another thing that needs doing to this paint is it needs bedding into the image, much like when I did the photo bashing. It doesn't make sense that this painted element has not received the damage that the rest of the APC body has. So using custom brushes, marquee selections, I can just start to chip that paint away and give the illusion that this paint has been on there since this tank was made, and all the action it's seen, as well as denting the body, has started to erode and make the paint chip away. So here is the finished art style and APC design. So using the brief as a guide, I was able to create this, and I think this art style is representative of what a AAA next-gen FPS could look like. It also has the functionality that was needed from the brief in the form of this gun and the rear hatch. So that's that one done, on to brief 2. So here's the second part, brief 2. Take the vehicle design from the last brief and redesign it to fit into a casual mobile strategy game. Here are the art style and art direction goals for this brief. A cartoony and completely stylized look to the design must be a clean and readable art style, and it also needs to look fun. The tone of this game is light-hearted, fun and playful. Realism is not a concern here, so this does not have to appear functional. And lastly, must be viewed from an isometric top-down point of view. So here is the start of brief 2. I took the existing design that we developed from the last brief and started to simplify it to work in a different game and a different art style. I don't need to go through the design process here, as we know what this thing looks like. We just have to adjust it to fit in with this new game art style. So I just messed around with the proportions here and created this 3D model as a base for the new designs. So as before, I'm going to use a really simple model as the base to do my line work over. One of the things that I'm trying to do in the line work here is lose the sharp angled edges to everything. That was appropriate for the last design, but here it just isn't. It's supposed to look a bit more fun, almost cuddly and very bubbly. The game that it's going to be featured in is a casual mobile game, so it does not need to look serious, hard-edged or gritty at all. I do want to include some of the details from the other design though, so I need to look at this panelization detail, but reduce the amount of lines, because when this is shrunk down on the screen, it will just look really noisy. So one thing I'm trying to juggle here is the amount of detail I can get away with that is readable from the point of view that the new game is in, while also retaining design elements from the original design. So you'll say I add the headlights, but when I put these bars in, I think it's just too much, and I think I remove them in the final design. So here is my finished line work for the new design. I added elements that were in the 3D just like before, but I now have a solid base to do my new painting with. So now I'm ready to do the painting. So the painting is going to convey a lot of the art style here. But one thing I won't be doing is using all the techniques from the last brief. They're just not appropriate to be used here. This is just good old-fashioned rendering form using color and tone. I'm just using a default Photoshop brush, again, no fancy brushes. I'm just concentrating on making all the forms read and pop clearly. One of the things that really needs to be taken into consideration with this one is the point of view in the game. It's top-down isometric, so this needs to read from that view, so I just want to make sure that all the shapes are clearly communicated to the player from that angle in the game. So just like before, I want to add all those cool little split lines and panel details, but I just need to be wary of how much I do and how little I do. I'm always thinking about the detail density here, what is too much, what is too little. I think when I do these bits, I might do 4 of these little sort of black squares to represent screw holes, but think it's just too much. I think 2 will suffice. And again, I'm looking at the original design and trying to mimic some of the shapes and patterns I did with the panel lines, but just picking and choosing what I use and what I don't use. It's very delicate balance getting all these elements to read right. So sometimes when I'm doing this, I'll paint something in, leave it, move around, paint something else, and then come back and remove them later on. I just need to balance it all. So one of the key design features from the last brief was this really bold graphic element. That's got to go in there, but again, it's simplified. So instead of being that 2 stripe chevron, it's now just 1 with that little triangle accent there on the side as well. Color-wise as well, you'll notice that this is a lot brighter. Them tones and colors just help sell the idea that this is just a much more light-hearted, fun game. And you'll notice with the optics part of the tank here is a lot simpler than the original design. Same with the smoke launchers, having them clusters just did not seem appropriate, so what I did was just make one huge giant smoke launcher. It makes it look a bit dinky, a bit more chibi, and again, it's just more appropriate for this art style. One of the final touches that I wanted to add was to match the presentation style from the previous image, so I wanted to add them flares back in. Even though the style is completely different, the process and thinking is still the same. I'm adding a light source here to the right and left of the APC, so I'll have to go in and make sure that all the light projected from these flares is hitting those surfaces. So here is where I start to think about all these additional light sources I'm putting in the scene affecting the main body of the tank. I'm just airbrushing in that really cool pinky purple onto the surfaces that are facing the light source. So even though this isn't a realistic looking thing, light still needs to act in a way that makes these images look cool and all the light sources are bouncing off surfaces as they should. Adding the smoke here. So in the last image, the smoke was very real and I had a very cool custom brush for doing that. But again, I'm just using that big round solid default Photoshop brush to make these smoke plumes look a bit more stylistically in line with the tank design. So all the elements in the scene, you know, they've got to match the art style. You've got to have consistency. So smoke, sparks, things like that, all needs to be a concise art style that works. So here is the finished design for Brief 2. It's quite clearly the same vehicle if you look at all the elements to it, but is now in a complete different art style. The tone has completely changed. It's now fun, dinky, and looks like it would fit in with a casual mobile game. So again, the art style is telling you something about the game before you even play it. So that is the end of my Imagine 2020 talk. I hope you enjoyed watching it, and I'm hoping any students out there will take something from that, whether it's some ideas about technique or approach, and also the idea about it's really good to develop that artistic range. So I'm going to leave it there. I'll catch you later. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can reach me at my Twitter, which is @moonsartwork, and enjoy the rest of the Imagine talks. Bye.